Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. The government's likely to pass a law banning farm-to-forest conversions to protect productive farmland for food production. It'll mean a restriction on planting forests on high-quality land, and it's a response to the previous government's emissions reduction plan. Agriculture Minister Todd McClay has emphasised the need to protect productive farmland, maintain food security, and ensure that forestry expansion doesn't come at the expense of agriculture and rural livelihoods. But have we placed too much importance on planting trees anyway? And should we be focusing on other efforts elsewhere? Today on the front page, University of Canterbury emeritus Professor David Norton is with us to break down what this all actually means and whether we'll be able to meet our ambitious climate targets. First off, David, can you tell us what farm-to-forest conversions actually are?
Yep, it's a good question because it's often quite confusing. And essentially, a company, it could be a New Zealand company, it could be an overseas company, purchases a farm, typically a sheep and beef farm, and they plant the whole farm up in fast-growing exotic trees, usually Pinus radiata, for carbon sequestration purposes.
And so what is carbon farming? Is that the planting of the pine to offset carbon emissions?
Yeah, it's not to offset carbon emissions. So carbon farming is basically the process of planting up a farm in fast-growing exotic trees with the objective to sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and to earn money from doing that. It is called offsetting because somebody who is producing emissions, a company that's using petrol, diesel, whatever, can then buy those credits to offset their emissions.
So what's the main evidence for the government wanting to restrict farm to forestry conversions?
Yeah, so the reason why they brought the restrictions in is because of concerns within the farming sector that good quality farmland was being taken out of farming and put into carbon forests. The difficulty with carbon forests is that they're a permanent land use. They have to be there forever because once you've drawn that carbon down from the atmosphere, it needs to stay in those trees in perpetuity. So it rules out any opportunity to go back into farming on that land again. So I think the biggest concern that drove this change was that desire to restrict that sort of locking up of potential farmland for the future. In the proposal, it restricts it that you can't do it on land use classes 1 to 5, and there's a limit on land use class 6 as well.
Well, that leads me on to my next question, actually. How do we determine what is high, medium, and low quality land?
Yeah, so there's a national system that ranks all land in New Zealand on its productivity, essentially. And so the most productive land would be land that's used for, say, cereal, wheat growing or other crops, horticulture, right through to the least productive land, which would be land that is, it might only graze 1 or 2 stock units per hectare. That's very, very low productivity. And so the idea of the regulations was to limit the conversion of high quality or highly productive farmland to pine trees and restrict that largely to lower productivity hill country, steeper hill country farmland.
That doesn't do anything to alleviate the fears of beef and sheep farmers, though, does it?
It shifts it more to the least productive end of the spectrum. So the better downlands, lower hill country lands has certainly got much more restrictions on it. Yeah, so it does alleviate it to some degree, but there is still a lot of concern in the farming community, I understand.
Yeah, because I saw in October last year, we saw the closure of Allianz Group's meat processing plant in Timaru, affecting about 600 jobs. And Fed farmers at that time pointed to land use changes, including the conversions to forestry, as a contributing factor. Obviously, the forestry industry disputed this, but in a situation like this, do the environmental gains outweigh, I guess, the jobs in rural communities?
From my perspective, and I'm an ecologist, that there are no environmental gains from doing this. I actually think carbon farming is a flawed process. It's basically a small group of people trying to make a lot of money in a short period of time with zero consideration for the future.
Yeah, because you made a good point before as well. To my very basic understanding, is that when you come in and plant these pine forests, it's like 100-year commitment. You have to be doing it consistently, cutting them down, regrowing for it to be any good, right?
Okay, that's a really good question, and there's two important points in there. A lot of these farm to forest conversions are not being managed for sustainable timber supply. They're simply being planted for carbon, and then basically the owners walk away and leave them. That's very different from a production plantation forest that's been managed on a sustainable rotation to produce timber every 30, 25, 30 years on an ongoing basis. So most of these farm to forest conversions are simply being planted up. They sequester carbon for 20, 30, 40 years, and then they have to be left in the ground because that carbon has been sequestered. They're not being managed into the future, and they impose massive economic and environmental liabilities on us as we move into future generations.
Why aren't they planting native species? Why is it always pine and exotic species?
Yep. That's a great question, and the reason is that the whole emissions trading scheme that this is all working through is set up to make pines the favoured outcome, and the incentives are all completely twisted and count against native forests. And I mean, I think it's really important to recognise that people are getting rich, making a lot of money, getting rich over a short period of time from carbon credits. They get their credits and they can forget about that forest. But someone's got to make sure that carbon stays in the ground in the future. And if the investors have taken their money and gone, then it's going to be future generations in New Zealand that are responsible for looking after that carbon that's been stored there, because it's supposed to be stored permanently. But at the same time, we know that these pine forests are not adapted to the New Zealand environment. They won't maintain themselves. They will collapse. They'll be sources of diseases, of deer, of pest species. And, we saw what happened in Cyclone Gabrielle. We saw what happened in Nelson, Tasman a few weeks ago. These forests are imposing massive environmental liabilities on us. And what we need is diverse native forests established across the landscape, interwoven into farming systems, not replacing farming, but interwoven through farming systems. Unfortunately, the ETS is stacked against that. It just doesn't make it possible at the moment. And this is what the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment said in his report recently. The whole system is wrong. It's set up against natives.
So what you're saying is we are going to have higher emissions leading up to 2030 because of your government's policies.
We're going to have...
Is that accurate?
No, what is accurate?
Is that accurate?
What is accurate?
Is that accurate? Will New Zealand have higher emissions than we would have under the previous government, under your government in the period leading to 2030?
What is accurate is to say that the emissions profile and the plan that we have put in place will enable us to meet our budgets for the period ending 2030.
That's not the question I asked, though. But the question I asked is, under your government's policies, will our emissions leading up to 2030 be higher than they would under the previous government?
Technically in the region of about 1.5 megatons of point of difference by the end of 2030.
Yeah.
Does our emissions reduction plan rely too heavily on forestry?
Absolutely. What we're doing is we're basically saying keep producing emissions. You can offset them, but actually what we need to be doing is cutting our emissions. And the emissions reduction plan isn't doing that. It's just relying on fast-growing trees to push the problem out into the future. Yeah, it's not addressing emissions reductions at all.
So the coalition brought in the removal of agriculture from the ETS, and that was welcomed by farmers, criticised by environmentalists. What do you make of this move?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to separate out methane, which is what livestock are producing, from all the other, all carbon dioxide, which is from petrol and diesel and all that stuff. And I think we need to have a separate biogenic system where farmers can offset their own emissions from their livestock on farm. Methane behaves very differently to CO2, and that should be done in one system. And then there should be a separate system that is focused on reducing our overall CO2 emissions from hydrocarbons. And the two should be separated out and dealt with quite separately.
alternatives are there, and should we be focusing on more?
Yeah, I think what we should be doing in New Zealand, from my perspective, is quite simply we should have a standalone biogenic methane system for farmers, and they can plant woodlots on their farms. They can use native vegetation to offset their methane productions. We need to have genuine tools in place that guarantee we reduce emissions. We're not reducing emissions. We've got to bring our emissions down, less fossil fuels. And we need to be building landscape resilience. And that, by building landscape resilience, by planting diverse native forests, by establishing more native wetlands, we can sequester, draw carbon down from the atmosphere, but we can also make sure that we don't get the damage we got in Cyclone Gabrielle and damage we got in Nelson and other parts of New Zealand. I'm involved with a project called Recloaking Papatūānuku, which Pure Advantage, a not-for-profit, has been developing, which is aiming to restore 2 million hectares of native forest and wetland across New Zealand, interwoven into our primary production landscapes. So not replacing farming, but part of farming, where farmers are rewarded for looking after native forests and establishing new native forests for all of those benefits, cultural biodiversity, resilience, carbon drawdown, and so forth.
Well, that kind of sounds like a win-win, doesn't it? Why aren't we making... So if I was a dairy farmer, say, is there a way that... So I've got my 50 cows... Say, I obviously have never visited a dairy farm, so I don't know how many cows there are, but say I've got 50 of them.
Probably a few more than 50. But...
can I then measure how much methane that they're producing and then be like, right, it's this much. I need to come up with a way to offset that on my land, say with native forests and stuff, and then kind of try and balance it out myself. Could I essentially do that?
Absolutely. Look, it's the science is very, very easy to use. I mean, we know how much methane a cow produces, so you could do that definitely. And I must say, some of the innovative dairy farmers are actually putting that information out there in the public. They are acknowledging how much they're producing. You can do the math, and you may not be able to do it on your land because your dairy farm might be too small, but you could work with, say, a sheep and beef farmer, and you could do it in a collaborative way.
Why don't we make farmers do that then?
It's a good question. The politics. I don't have the answer to that one.
I wouldn't mind my tax money going, giving a few bob to farmers to create native farmlands.
Well, I think, I think there are lots of avenues that we could fund it through. I mean, there's a lot of interest internationally in high quality carbon and biodiversity credits. So people would be really interested, I think, in investing in New Zealand. We're a stable democracy. We're a reliable country for that sort of work. But farmers themselves, I mean, that they will at some point need to offset their methane production. So that the incentive is for them to invest into their own land. But it's building resilience in their land, and it's helping make their land more stable. It's got other benefits out of it. I mean, I work with farmers, dairy and sheep and beef farmers, helping them design restoration programs for their farms so they can bring back native forest. I mean, there are really great people out there doing this already. We just need the national policy signals in place to make this a reality. And I think for that, we need to acknowledge that we are being impacted by climate change. We need to acknowledge that. We need to have a national resilience plan of which, putting native forests back into landscapes as part of farming systems is a really sustainable long-term outcome. Pine trees are short-term. They're not doing anything for the future. Native forests, native wetlands are bringing all these other values and biodiversity, who we are as New Zealanders, all these other values back into our landscapes.
Of the 200 odd countries in the world today, it looks like we are the only one that's carbon neutral. Actually, that's not quite accurate. Bhutan is not carbon neutral. Bhutan is carbon negative. Our entire country generates 2.2 million tons of carbon dioxide. But our forests, they sequester more than 3 times that amount. So we are a net carbon sink for more than 4 million tons of carbon dioxide each year.
What about if we look overseas? Are there any other countries that are focusing, not as much on forestry, I suppose, but are there any good projects that we should be really keeping an eye on?
There's a range of different initiatives being taken in different countries and different ways of incentivizing and encouraging people to get involved in these sorts of projects. But I actually believe that New Zealand has the opportunity to show other countries, so turning it around, we have the opportunity to show other countries how we can do this sort of stuff. We're a small country, we're innovative. We just need to get out of this mindset at the moment of just focusing on today and actually think about the future. And we've got huge, credibility, scientific background in this stuff. We know how to do it. We just need the political will behind that to support it.
Do you think farming and forestry voices are equally represented?
It's interesting. I hate to think what's going on, behind the closed doors in Wellington and who's influencing what. What's not being represented is the voice of the environment. And that's my real concern, is that the environment is not being listened to. I think I work with a lot of farmers, and my impression is that farmers are really interested in looking after the land, are really interested in a sustainable outcome. They get the impact that climate change has on their businesses, on their land, and they're in it for the long term. Farmers are in it for the long term. And I think we just need to have the right incentives there to help assist them with achieving those sorts of outcomes that I've talked about.
I mean, the Climate Change Commission last month warned that while we're making progress and emissions are on track to meet the first budget, that's 2022 to 2025, we still need to urgently do more work. At the rate we're going, do you think that we're going to meet our Paris climate commitments?
No. From everything I've seen, we're not. We're still consuming too much. We're still using too much. We're still living in today. We're not thinking about tomorrow. And I think we're struggling. And I think relying on offsetting with short-lived pine trees is just a massive mistake. It's just pushing the problem off. Has
this latest move set us back a bit?
I think it's just simply carrying us down a dead-end street. And I think we need to, like Simon Upton said, the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment said, we need to radically overhaul the ETS. We need to shift fast-growing exotics into a biogenic methane system, and we need to start putting in place an approach that's based around using native forests with long-term, enduring carbon sequestration. It's going to be there forever with all of the other benefits for the landscape, for people, for biodiversity. But the government doesn't seem to be interested in that, and that's a real tragedy, I think, because the people that are going to suffer are going to be the next generation and the one after that, and so on.
Thanks for joining us, David.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Ethan Sills and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.